You're tuning in because you're keen on staying informed, especially on development shaping India's future. And if you're a UPSC aspirant, well, understanding our workforce and social safety nets is absolutely key.
Absolutely. For prelims, for mains, it's everywhere.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive. We're looking at a significant piece from the Hindu. It really unpacks India's recent moves trying to bring app-based gig workers into the Social Security fold.
Yeah, and what those changes really tell us about let's say, the bigger picture.
Right. The Hindu highlights how India is grappling with providing that safety net for this, massive and growing group. App-based workers, they operate outside the usual job structures.
And these proposals, things like health cover under Ayushman Bharat, getting registered on the Ishram portal, even this transaction-based pension idea, they're definitely steps being taken.
Okay, let's unpack this because, look, on the surface, more Social Security, it sounds great, right? An obvious positive.
Sure, it seems straightforward.
But the Hindu suggests it's, a bit more layered. So our mission here, kind of twofold. First, what do these initiatives actually mean for gig workers?
Yeah, their significance.
And second, maybe even more critical, how do these changes sort of expose the underlying strengths, but also, importantly, the weaknesses in India's whole social protection system? What's the main takeaway here?
I think the core insight is this. These efforts, they might look like they're just for gig workers, but they actually act like a lens,
The lens.
Yeah, a lens to examine the whole architecture of Social Security in India. We can see how it adapts, or maybe how it struggles to adapt to this changing world of work.
Got it. So point one from the Hindu, this is a real shift in approach. We're moving away from that old idea, the one linking Social Security tightly to formal employment, to that traditional employer-employee setup.
Exactly.
For our UPSC listeners thinking about labor laws, why is this specific shift so important for gig workers?
Well, it's all about adapting, isn't it? The nature of work is changing. Gig workers, they often don't have that one single boss.
Right, multiple platforms maybe.
Yeah. Income goes up and down, the standard benefits package that comes with a full-time job, it just doesn't map onto their reality.
To an extent.
So extending Social Security means policymakers have to, think outside that old box. They have to innovate.
And that innovation, it brings us to this idea of a universal account number for pensions. The Hindu calls it seamless tracking. For UPSC folks, looking at governance. Implementation. How does this system work? Why is it good for someone working across, say, 3 different apps?
Think of it like a portable fund, almost. A gig worker gets money from various places, right?
Yeah.
This universal number lets all those earnings, all the contributions, pool into one spot. So every platform they work with could chip in a bit towards their pension.
Proportionally.
Exactly. Even if the work is just here and there, it recognizes how fluid gig work really is. These contributions, probably a small percentage taken automatically each time they finish a job on a platform.
Okay, that definitely sounds more in tune with how the gig economy actually functions.
It has to be.
And the Hindu highlights the inclusive vision here, moving away from excluding people towards recognizing labor rights for informal workers more broadly. It feels like the definition of who deserves protection is getting wider.
Precisely. For decades, huge parts of India's workforce doing all sorts of informal jobs have been largely outside that safety net.
Sure.
So these reforms, even if they start with gig workers, they signal a potential shift. A move towards a more inclusive idea of labor rights, acknowledging vulnerability isn't just in traditional jobs.
That's a really key point for anyone thinking about social justice or inclusive growth for the UPSC exams.
Definitely.
But, as often happens, progress here highlights problems elsewhere.
Yeah.
The Hindu is pretty direct about the systemic flaws in the broader social protection system that these gig worker plans kind of bring into focus.
Yes, it's not all rosy.
So let's dig into those. First up, this idea of a piecemeal commitment. What does the Hindu mean by that? What's the issue with not having a, comprehensive approach?
If you look at India's history with social welfare, which the article kind of implies, you see this pattern. We tackle specific needs for specific groups, but often in isolation.
Right, not a joined-up approach.
Exactly. A big example. India hasn't ratified the ILO's Social Security Minimum Standards Convention, number 102.
Okay, Convention 102.
Yeah, from 1952. It sets out comprehensive minimum standards for Social Security health, pensions, unemployment, the lot. By not ratifying, it suggests, perhaps, a reluctance to commit to a universal baseline for everyone.
So we end up with patches, Not a full safety net.
Kind of, yeah. A collection of potentially disconnected pieces, each maybe with its own issues.
And it's not just about international stuff, is it? Our own laws, like the Code on Social Security that was meant to be a big step, right? Consolidating everything.
It was meant to be, yes.
But the Hindu knows it's faced a lot of criticism. For our UPSC listeners studying legislation, what are the main worries about the code?
Well, exactly. The aim was good, streamline, modernize. But critics point to ambiguities like even the definition of gig worker isn't totally clear-cut.
Definitional issues.
Right. And concerns that protections might actually be weaker than in older laws. Plus, huge questions about how it'll actually be implemented and enforced across such a diverse country.
Implementation challenges, always a big one.
These weaknesses are crucial to grasp when you're analyzing how effective our Social Security system really is.
Okay, another major concern from the Hindu, this heavy reliance on welfare boards to actually deliver the benefits.
Yes, the boards.
For anyone not familiar, what are these boards and what are the main problems with how they operate, according to the article?
So these welfare boards are basically special bodies set up for specific worker groups. Construction workers have one, BD workers have one, now maybe gig workers will get one.
And they're funded how?
Usually through a specific tax collected from those industries or employers. But, and this is the critical part the Hindu points out, there are persistent issues with inefficiency.
Inefficiency.
And really worryingly, underutilization of funds. RTI requests, CAG reviews, they've shown huge amounts of this cess money just sitting there, unspent.
Wow, unspent funds.
Yes, and massive delays in getting benefits to the people who are supposed to receive them. The money's there, but it's not flowing effectively. That's deeply concerning.
It's like the delivery system itself is the bottleneck.
It certainly seems to be a major factor.
The Hindu even mentions Kerala, right? A state usually seen as progressive on social policy. But even there, the performance of these boards is uneven.
Exactly.
That seems really telling, especially for those studying state-level governance for UPSC.
It is telling. It suggests the problems aren't always just about lack of political will, but maybe deeper systemic issues. Governance, administration, just getting the execution right through these board structures.
So you have this step-by-step approach, relying on these boards that have issues. What are the bigger consequences for social protection in India, according to the Hindu? How does this affect who gets what?
It leads to a few big problems. Firstly, as the article says, it creates a really fragmented system.
Fragmented, okay.
You've got BD workers, construction workers, gig workers, domestic workers, each group treated like a separate silo. Its own board, its own funding, its own rules, its own processes.
Sounds incredibly complicated, like a maze.
It can be.
So what's wrong with that fragmentation? Isn't tailoring schemes sometimes good?
Yeah.
Especially with work changing so fast?
Well, tailoring sounds good in theory, but in practice, it creates a really uneven playing field. Your access to vital support ends up depending less on how vulnerable you actually are and more on which bureaucratic box you tick.
So it's about classification, not need.
Pretty much. The Hindu emphasizes this. Workers in equally precarious jobs might get totally different levels of support just because they're classified differently. That raises big questions about fairness, equity.
That inherent unfairness, that comes through. And that leads to the next point. And the Hindu, focusing so much on new groups like gig workers, might end up reinforcing exclusion for others. That phrase, hierarchy of informality, is quite stark. For UPSC aspirants thinking about social equity, what does that hierarchy mean?
It's a powerful idea and, yeah, a bit unsettling. By putting the spotlight on newer, maybe more visible informal workers, like gig workers, you risk overlooking millions of others.
Like who?
Well, think about street vendors, agricultural laborers, domestic workers who've been struggling without enough protection for ages. Are we accidentally creating a pecking order where some informal jobs get more attention, more resources than others?
It does feel a bit like treating symptoms, maybe, without tackling the root cause. The Hindu argues this piecemeal way favors short-term fixes over structural reform.
That's a key distinction.
Can you explain the difference? Why is structural reform more important for the long run?
Exactly. Look, setting up a new board for gig workers, it addresses an immediate need, gets some positive press maybe, but it doesn't fix the fundamental weaknesses in the whole system. Things like poor governance, lack of transparency in managing money, weak enforcement so benefits don't even reach people.
Right, the underlying issues remain.
Short-term fixes give temporary relief. Structural reforms aim to build a stronger, fairer system that lasts.
And the Hindu points out, historically, These narrow schemes sometimes just fade away or get shut down. Why mention that history?
Yeah, the article reminds us we've seen this before. Older welfare boards for specific groups have closed down over time. Maybe the industry changed, maybe the scheme wasn't sustainable.
So it raises questions about today's approach.
It raises valid concerns about the long-term viability, the adaptability of just creating more and more isolated structures for different groups.
Okay, so given all these limitations, the fragmentation, the reliance on potentially inefficient boards, the short-term focus, what's the alternative the Hindu points towards?
The alternative is moving towards universal social protection.
Universal social protection. Okay.
Here.
For our UPSC listeners thinking about policy ideas, what would that actually look like in India? What are the core ideas?
The core idea is simple, really. Guarantee a basic level of social security to all residents, not just based on your job or who employs you.
Regardless of employment status.
Exactly. Moving away from all these separate category-based schemes towards something more integrated, more inclusive, and crucially, the Hindu emphasizes this will be much more adaptable to future changes in work, technology, economic shifts, whatever comes next.
So it's shifting from who employs you to your right as a resident.
That's a good way to put it. That's the fundamental shift.
And the Hindu suggests the current Social Security Code, even with its flaws, could be a starting point if we treat it as a minimum baseline.
Yes, that's an interesting point. The code might not be perfect now, but it gives a legislative framework to build on.
And the role of states.
Crucial. The Hindu highlights that states need the flexibility within the code to experiment, to innovate, develop schemes that fit their local situation, but always aiming for universality, for sustainability.
So the code sets the floor. States can build higher.
Precisely. States can innovate, maybe even go beyond the minimums, to create truly comprehensive safety nets.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. It sounds like these efforts for gig workers, they're good, they're needed, but they've also thrown a spotlight on some, well, significant cracks in the foundation of our whole social protection system.
That's a fair summary. We're extending the reach, which is positive, but the underlying structure, it might need serious work to handle the future.
Yeah, the current piecemeal approach, it risks making inequalities worse, maybe, and it doesn't seem to build that resilient system we'll need as work keeps changing.
Exactly. And for UPSC aspirants, think about how this connects to bigger themes like federalism, the role of states versus the center in welfare. It's all linked.
Absolutely. And for everyone preparing for UPSC, understanding these nuances is just vital. We're talking core themes: social justice, economic development, governance effectiveness.
You need to know the policy details, sure, but also grasp the structural challenges, the big debates around social security in India.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe for our listeners to chew on.
Go for it.
How could a truly universal social protection system change things? Not just for workers' lives, but for the whole Indian economy's resilience, its fairness, especially with work changing so fast.
And perhaps what are the biggest hurdles? What stops us moving towards that kind of system in such a complex country? Definitely food for thought for your preparation.
Indeed. Lots to think about. We really hope this deep dive into the Hindu's analysis has given you a clearer, more nuanced view on this critical issue.
Hope it was useful.
If you found this helpful for your UPSC prep or just your interest in India's development, please do hit like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment. Let us know your questions.
We're always keen to hear your thoughts.
And remember, the source for this in-depth exploration was the Hindu. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.